بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وصحبه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. We are continuing our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah by Faqih al-Nafs Imam Abu al-Ikhlas Hassan ibn Ammar al-Bulali rahimahullah ta'ala, and we looked at the different types of over water, and we reached Faslun fi al-Tahadri, the section on exercising one's judgment. And this section is important not only as it relates to containers, but it also relates more broadly to exercising one's judgment in matters related to doubts. And there are governing principles, of course, that relate to this. So we're going to look at that one by one. The first issue is, he says, it says, Faslun fi al-Tahadri. What is tahadri? And there is a useful definition of tahadri, right? By Imam al-Tahtawi in his Hashiyah, when he says هو تفريغ الوسع والجهد لتمييز الطاهر عن غيره. Right? It's to exercise one's utmost capacity and effort. Al-wus'a is capacity, and juhud, effort, to distinguish between the pure and the impure. Right? And التحري, the author of Kashaf al-Sabahat noted, التحري is a talab, is to seek something, right? And he gives a very good definition of it, right? He says that شرعا هو طلب الشيء من العبادات بغالب الرأي. هو طلب الشيء من العبادات بغالب الرأي, is to seek something with غالب الرأي or غلبة الظن, right? With reasonable surety, إذا عند تعذر الوقوف على الحقيقة, when the reality of something cannot be known. And some of the fuqaha said that tahadri is used in ibadat, and the word tawakhi with a ta, tawakhi is used in mu'amalat. And he quotes that from the Mabsut of Imam al-Sarakhsi, I believe. So tahadri is exercising one's best judgment. Another cool definition, because sometimes rhyming definitions may be a little poetic, but it sticks. And that is often very helpful. So one of the definitions the fuqaha give is that tahadri is بذل المجهود لنيل المقصود. بذل المجهود, striving one's utmost to attain what is desired. But what is the asl of the mas'ala? And the asl is that if you can be certain about something, then the asl, al-aslu huwa al-amal bil-yaqeen. You can be certain about something. Right? So you went to sleep, you get up, and you're having trouble sleeping, so you close all the blinds. And you don't want any notifications, because you're thinking maybe the notifications wake you up. You don't need artificial light from alarm. You wake up, now you don't know, is it Fajr or not? It maybe is, but you don't have any way of telling. You gotta open the blinds and look outside, right? Because you can do that, you can't just say, well, I think I feel relaxed, I feel sufficiently satisfied from my sleep that it must be Fajr. No. Right? So the base, الأصل هو العمل باليقين. They say إذا تعذر اليقين يصار إلى الظن. Right? When certainty is not possible, then one resorts to reasonable surety. But we know that certainty does not have to be sought beyond one's capacity. Right? Because we know the principles of difficulty and ease. Okay? So when they say that it's exercising one's utmost, and they say دون مشقة ولا حرج, without hardship, without difficulty nor hardship. دون مشقة أو حرج. Right? So you've got something on your clothes. Technically, you could go to a lab and get DNA analysis, and you'll know not only whether it's najasa or not, you'll know where the ancestors of that animal came from. Right? But you don't need to do something like that, because that would make life quite difficult. So, right? So that's that one leaves certainty when there's difficulty in attaining certainty. Right? Particularly in those things that al-aslu fiha taysir, the thing that the basis of which is facilitation, amongst which is the rulings related to purity. The basis of them is not hardship, it's rather facilitation. Okay, so that's there's also an important principle, right, that has two components. They say, because of the mabda of taysir in the shara, the basis of facilitation in the shara. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not make a soul responsible for more than it is able. وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. He has not placed any hardship for you in religion. يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرِ. Allah seeks ease for you. وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرِ. And does not seek hardship for you. إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينَ يُسْرِ. Said the Prophet. Although he also said, إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينَ مَتِينٌ. This religion is deep. فَأَوْغِلُوا فِيهِ بِرِفْقٍ. So enter into it gently. So one of the principles related to that, one of the qa'idah al-fiqhiyya is إِذَا ضَاقَ الْأَمْرُ اتَّسَعَ الْحُكْمُ. If matters become constrained, become ضيق, اتَّسَعَ الْحُكْمُ. The ruling becomes more expansive. This is the part. The haraj, the hardship is averted, just as harm is averted. But there's a corollary to that, which is وَإِذَا اتَّسَعَ ضَاقَ. But if matters become expansive again, the rulings become more tight. Right? And this applies to when there's these principal issues related to tahaddi. Now he mentions tahaddi related primarily to two things, right? Which are awani and fiyad, exercising one's judgment as to the purity of containers of water, number one. Number two, clothing. Because you need water and you need clothing to get into purity, to clothe your nakedness, to be able to pray. But the same principles apply, and we've shared the same section. It's a brief section from the Hadith al-Alaiya. Same thing applies actually to meat. As shocked as some of us may be, but also applies to meat. And we'll come to that in a second. The summary of the rulings is that if, and this is of course assuming that there are no other reasonable options. Right? If there are no other reasonable options. So, if containers become mixed, some pure, some impure, then if most are pure, then one exercises one's judgment, one makes tahadri for wudu and for drinking. So the containers are mixed. 3 containers, 2 are pure, 1 is impure. You don't know which one is the impure one. You use your judgment both for wudu and for drinking. If most are filthy, then one makes tahadri for drinking, because you can't do without drinking. And this, of course, when there's a need to drink. Because let's say you got locked into Seekers, but someone's coming and says, I got a drink, and the water's cut, whatever they're doing renovations. No, right? You need to pray, but you could wait half an hour. This is when there's no other alternatives, you know. But one would not, if most of the containers are najis, then one would not make tahadri for wudu. Because there's a principle, al-hukmu lil-ghalib. And this is a dhabit. It's a very tricky dhabit that they say al-hukmu lil-ghalib. The rulings apply to the general case. And this is closer to being a dhabit than a qa'ida. It's more a governing criteria that sort of, it's an approximative criteria that applies in certain cases, doesn't, but it doesn't have, it's not, this is not one of them. So, so this is with respect to containers. So in that case, we'll see what you do. You have 2 containers that are filthy, one is impure, one is, two are filthy, one is pure. Then, in the case of clothing, one must exercise one's judgment whether most are pure or impure. Why? Because there's no alternative to covering one's awrah. There's an alternative to wudu, which is tayammum. But just imagine, you know, Brother Bill became Muslim and he thinks most of his clothing had najasa. He doesn't put on anything. He says, sorry guys, I think my clothing was najis. It's less bad to wear najasa and to pray than to pray naked, obviously. So that's the basic summary of the rulings. Let's see what قال رحمه الله تعالى لو اختلط أواني أكثرها طاهر تحرى للوضوء والشرب. If containers become mixed, one exercises one judgment both for للتوضؤ والشرب, both for making wudu and for drinking. He says in the commentary, لو اختلط, right? اختلاط مجاورة لا ممازجة. If containers become mixed, and this is the mixing of mujawara, they're next to each other. Jawara yujawiru, to be next to each other, not la mumazaja, not of being mixed, because if they're mixed, small containers, they mix najis. Okay? أوان is plural of إناء, جمع إناء. أكثرها طاهر, I'm going to say the obvious, وأقلها نجس. And this is done for the purpose of clarity, they say. يعني مقام التعليم, مقام التصريح, the station of teaching, the station of being explicit. لأهمية الوضوح. That's why the method is called نور الإيضاح, the light of clarity. مثلا التعليم. تحرى للتوضؤ, one uses one's judgment for making wudu. والاغتسال, likewise for ghusl. You can say ghusl, which is the act, or اغتسال, which is the افتعل from غسل, and is engaging in full washing of the body. قيد الأكثر أنه قيد بالأكثر لأنه يتيمم عند تساوي الأواني. Right? He limited this case by being the majority of the containers being طاهر, because if they're the same, then one makes tayammum. والأفضل, and what's best, and this is عند التساوي, if they're equal, and يمزجها, that one just mix them together, أو يريقها, or to pour them out, فيتيمموا لفقد المطهر قطعا. Then one makes tayammum, so that one for sure doesn't have the mutahhir. But that's contested. There's at least 3 reasons why it's contested. One is because then you are wasting water. Number 2, you might be thirsty. Like if you're in the desert and you only have limited water, if you do any of this, you're going to die. So this is الأفضل نظرا وقد لا يكون عملا. Right? Just theoretically best is to just mix it or pour it. وإن وجد 3 رجال 3 أوان أحدها نجس وتحرك كل إناء جازت صلاتهم وحدانا. So 3 individuals found 3 containers, one of which is najis, for sure. Right? How? What if a child comes and says, I urinated in one of these containers? Would we deem the container to be najis? Would we? You don't have to believe the child. But you exercise judgment. Seems like a sensible kid, etc. But unless you know the person is upright, even if they're morally responsible, you don't have to believe them unless you know that they're upright. You look at it, doesn't look filthy, you say it's pure. I don't know, you seem like a nice guy. Well, I know him, his father, but they say, I don't know this guy. He just showed up and says that my son urinated in one of these containers. I'm going to make wudu from that same container if there's no signs of najasa. Why? I don't know who you are. Right? Okay. Like someone told Shaykh al-Halabi at the Haram that you missed one of the wajibat of the prayer. Abdul looked at him, says, Ma wajibat as-salah. The guy said, I don't know. Be quiet. And he went and he walked away. Right? Because you don't have to believe anybody, right? فتبين. Okay? And that's a very important principle that applies overall. The Quranic verse, we talked about it in the Tafsir of Surah Al-Hujurat, which is an on-demand course. And secret is that really all of the science of hadith can be derived from the Quranic verse in جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبين. If a corrupt person comes to you with news, then make it clear. Now, how do you know a corrupt person comes to you? If a person comes to you, do they come with a billboard saying, أنا فاسق? No. Before you accept what they say, you have to make sure who is it that is saying it. Before even thinking about what they said or not, first thing is to make sure the person is worthy of listening. And if it's something that's not your business, the sunnah is not to investigate. Okay? Now, the purity here is your business, so you won't need to investigate. So, if three individuals find three containers, one of which is najis, and this is taking out possibility of waswasa, doubt, for sure one is najis. Turns out they've gone camping and there's three containers. Two had water, the three had water. He thought this container was what they talk about, having a container for urinating. So he urinated at night in one of them. So for sure, they know that one of them is filthy. Now, what if I'm one of the three people? Whose judgment am I responsible for? Let's say we're camping together. You said, when you looked at them, I think that's the one that's najis. Am I morally bound by your judgment? No. I could just say, I believe you. So I follow your tahadri. But I say no. You said it's number 2, I think it's number 1. Yusuf thinks it's number 3. Can we force each other to change our opinions? Can I say, well, I'm the Amir, I'm deciding? No, we follow our conscience in that. If you wish to exercise one judgment. You can leave it to the judgment of one person, or you don't have to. So in that case, each person's prayer would be valid. Nobody would have to repeat the prayer. You're going to say, well, one of our prayers is for sure invalid. So it's you. No, right? Like we draw lots. No. So for sure, we're only responsible إذا تعذر اليقين يصار إلى الظن. When certainty is not possible, we're morally responsible for exercising our judgment. But their prayer would be valid alone, not in congregation. Right? But they've made things difficult for themselves. The adab there to facilitate is not to get everybody to exercise it. Okay. So appoint one person to say, could you check which one is najis? And you say it's number 2, so we follow his judgment. We could all make wudu with that one. Right? Okay. وكذا يتحرى مع كثرة الطاهر لإرادة الشرب. And likewise, one uses one's judgment if most of the containers are pure for the reason of drinking. لأن المغلوب كالمعدوم, because the maghlub, that the lesser is like as if non-existent. Is meaning shar'an, right? It's shar'an considered as if non-existent. Why دفعا للحرج, to ward off hardship. Now, this last one, don't do it, because when you have to exercise your judgment, then one should have azm, should have resolve. التردد يوقع في الوسوسة. Right? Wavering leads to waswasa. Not exercising one's judgment when judgment is called for also leads to waswasa, and this leads to hardship. So, وَإِن لَمْ يَتَحَرَّى, if the person found mixed containers, three containers, 2 are tahir, 1 is najis, right? وَتَوَضَّأَ بِكُلٍّ وَصَلَّ صَحَّةً إِن مَسَحَ فِي مَوْضِعَيْنِ مِنْ رَأْسِهِ. Don't do this, right? So one made wudu with each of the containers. 2 are pure, 1 is najis. It'll be valid if one wiped two different parts of the head, not the whole head. Because then the head is for sure najis, because one of the times is najis. Right? لا في موضع, not if you only wipe from one place. لأن تقديم الطاهر مزيل للحدث. Because if you made wudu first with the tahir, it removed the ritual impurity. The hadath ما يوجب الوضوء أو الغسل. The hadath, the ritual impurity, is that which requires wudu or ghusl. وقد تنجس بالثاني, then it would be najis with the second. وفاقد المطهر يصلي مع النجاسة. And if one doesn't have anything to purify with, meaning فاقد المطهر, in here, this is فاقد المطهر للنجاسة. This is important, right? The one who cannot remove, who cannot purify, meaning who cannot purify filth. So you have filth on your body, and يصلي معها, can pray with it, and the prayer is valid. And this applies also to someone who's hospitalized, for example. Right? They can't get off the hospital bed. The najasa that's on them, if they cannot remove it themselves without hardship, it's excused. Right? And it does not have to be undue hardship. Right? It just that which is normally considered hard. And that would include practically, and there's many furu'a that attest to this. Someone, for example, who gets urine drops, for example, on their trouser while at work. Because it's not, so you would minimize that filth. Why? Because washing your trousers at work, now if you have another pair of trousers, right? I have someone in my family who would keep 2, sometimes 3 pairs of trousers at work because he kept ripping his trousers. My advice is just buy better quality trousers, you've got a good job now. Okay? So because there's a separate issue, which is someone who does not have water nor something to make tayammum with, that's a problematic issue. And we'll come to that when we come to prayer. وطهر بالغسل الثاني إذا قدم النجس. And if one made wudu first with the najis and the second water was pure, then one became pure with the second. ومسح محلا آخر من رأسه, as long as one wiped a different place in one's head. But don't do this. This is not a prescriptive ruling, this is a descriptive ruling. A prescriptive ruling is, this is what you should do. A descriptive ruling is, if you do this, then this is the ruling. إن مسح محلا بالمائين دار الأمر بين الجواز لو قدم الطاهر. But if one wipes the same place with the 2 waters, then the matter would be between permissibility if one wiped first with the pure, وعدم الجواز لتنجس البلل, and not non-permissibility because the area became najis بأول ملاقاة, with the first contact. لو أخر الطاهر, if the second water was pure, فلا يجوز للشك احتياطا, and it would not be permitted out of doubt. Advice is, you have to exercise judgment which one of them is pure, use your judgment, and move on. وإن كان أكثرها أي المختلطة بالمجاورة, if most of the containers that got mixed by being next to each other, najisan are filthy, لا يتحرى إلا للشرب, then one does not exercise one's judgment except for drinking. لنجاسة كلها حكما للغالب, because then they're considered as if all of them are filthy for the purpose of purification. عملا بالغالب. فيريقها عند عامة المشايخ, then one will just pour it out according to most of the scholars. Okay? Because there's an issue that najis water cannot be benefited from. Okay? ويمزجها لسقي الدواب عند الطحاوي. And according to Imam al-Tahawi, one would give it to animals to drink from, and but the way you give it to animals is to let them drink from it, not to give it to the animal to drink. Because there's an important principle that applies to animals too. It's a general principle. ما لا يجوز تناوله لا يجوز إعطاؤه. Another of the principles from the إشباه والنظائر. ما لا يجوز تناوله. Anything not permitted to use is not permitted to give. That applies across the board. If you cannot, so let's say if you got a haram, someone gave you, and we're not, something that's within the khilaf is within the khilaf. We're talking about someone gave you pork chops. So neighbor on the right, you have Mr. Right and Mr. Left, and you live in the middle. Mr. Right gave you pork chops from their barbecue. You go give them to Mr. Left. You can't do that. Why? Because anything not permitted to consume is not permitted to give. But the ulama mention what's the makhraj in that? In the things that are not of manifest harm, you can let someone take it. So you can go to your neighbor and say, Mr. Left, I got these chops. I feel bad giving them back. If you're interested, would you like to take them? He says, sure. So you didn't give them. You let them take it. But that applies to those things that are not of manifest harm, right? That the prohibition, for example, of pork is ta'abbudi. There's no rationally discernible harm in pork. You say, oh, well, pigs eat, that's all, a hikmah madnoona. It's just a broad wisdom that they eat from filth. Well, you think chickens are that well behaved? Right? Like if you know anything about chickens or anything, like all animals will eat the filth if you don't give them anything better. So, but you can't do that with alcohol, for example, right? Because it's of evident harm. You can't do that with music. Because of harm, right? But that's a separate issue. Now that gets tricky because can you use filth? Okay. For example, as fertilizer. Can you use that? Those become fatwa questions. In some parts of the subcontinent, they use cow dried dung as fuel, and people buy it and sell it. Those are fatwa issues. That's outside the issue of Faraz. So it's not an absolute. وفي وجود الثياب المختلطة يتحرى مطلقا. And if there are items of clothing that have been mixed together, some for sure this, then one always makes that exercise of judgment. سواء كان أكثرها طاهرا أو نجسا, whether the most of them are pure or filthy. لأنه لا خلف للثوب, because there's no substitute. خلف is a substitute, no replacement. خلف is that which comes after something. So salaf is that which came before, and khalaf is that which comes after. Right? Khalaf min ba'dihi, and they came after them. From the same root you have ikhtalafa, which is the ifta'ala from khalaf, which is when one person went apart from the other. Khalafa, fa'ala, to go against. Right? Etc. So it's a very interesting root. So there's no substitute for clothing, في ستر العورة, for covering one's awra. الماء يخلفه التراب, but water has the substitute of turab, right? Of course, turab here, if you wanted to be picky, you could say as-sa'id. Right? Water has a substitute of dust. By dust being al-ghalib, because normally people would use dust, and that avoids the difference of opinion of the Shafi'is and the Hanafis. Well, you'll see the condition is sa'idan tayyiba, anything naturally on the top surface of the earth. Doesn't have to be this. No ghubar is required. وإن صلى في أحد الثوبين متحريا. Now, what if one second guesses? You had two items of clothing, one that your neighbor's dog came and urinated on, and the other is pure. So first you said, this one's tahir, so you prayed in it, prayed dhuhr in it, and sat, made dhikr for 5 hours, then Asr time came. I think that's the pure one. What do you do? There's two legal principles that are important here. One is that الاجتهاد لا ينقض بمثله. That one exercise of judgment is not negated by the like of it. Now, if you're sitting there making dhikr and then you look at it and you see the big stain of the dog's urine, and you go smell it, and you got to repeat of the smell you had when you saw the event take place. And that's no longer tahadri, right? Because you have yaqeen now. But there's one principle that al-ijtihad la yuqaddu mithlihi. One judgment is not annulled by another. Another principle that applies here is, although it has looser application here, but it's a very important principle, that من سعى في نقض ما تم من جهته فسعيه مردود عليه. And it doesn't apply directly here, but it's worth. Doesn't apply fully here, but it relates to the other one. And why does it relate to? Which is من سعى لنقض ما تم من جهته. Whoever takes the means to negate something that was completed from their own actions, then their efforts are rejected. Now, in life, for example, someone got married in a manner, let's say, only valid in the Hanafi school. We're not going to tell you how, right? Then the lady realizes, man, he snores too much. Then she leaves him. She says, you know what? I'm not going to divorce you. But our marriage was not valid. Because it's not valid in the Shafi'i school. Because you act on one opinion, you cannot then say, well, another opinion is not valid, so it's not binding. Right? You purchased a house based on the Hanafi opinion that it's valid, although improper for precious transactions, to just make an exchange. You know, I asked you, how much are you selling this house for? You said $2 million. So I came with $2 million, put it on the table. You accepted? No, offer and accept. Then I got in trouble with my wife. That's it. By the way, that was invalid in the Shafi'i school. Give me my money back. I can't do that because once I acted on one thing, I cannot negate my action by taking another judgment. So when صلى في أحد ثوبين, one prayed in one of two items of clothing, متحريا لنجاسة أحدهما, exercising the judgment that one of them was najis. ثم أراد صلاة الأخرى فوقع تحريه على غير الذي صلى فيه. Then your judgment changed that the other one was the najis one. لم يصح. Then this is not valid. لأن إمضاء الاجتهاد لا ينقض بمثله. And this is similar to the expression, because once you've acted on a judgment, you cannot annul it by the like of it. بل بأعلى منه, but rather only by something higher than it. Okay? And this would also This is one way of causing hardship to oneself. And so this one needs to apply as one of the qawaid of daf' al-waswasa. Once you exercise judgment, you said, I have wudu, and you prayed. Then you said, maybe I didn't. So let me make wudu again and pray again. Is it correct to do that? No. Because once you exercise judgment that you had wudu and you prayed on it, then repeating that prayer would be against the sunnah. And the Prophet ﷺ said explicitly about repeating prayer like that, لا يصلى بعد صلاة مثلها. It's a very intriguing hadith that has multiple meanings in it, that one does not pray after one prayer the like of it. The main meaning of it is على سبيل الوسوسة, if it's based on waswasa, أو ظن فاسد, or wrongful conjecture. Okay? And then إمضاء الاجتهاد لا ينقض بمثله, because one exercise judgment does not change by another. But there is an exception. إلا في القبلة, except in the qibla. We made one judgment about the qibla لأنها تحتمل الانتقال, because it could shift. But this is not theoretically that the qibla itself could shift, which happened once. It went from where? From Jerusalem but rather the judgment regarding the qibla could shift. Right? Right? Because if you're far from the qibla, or you're only responsible for the direction, and that judgment could well shift. And it's and it's also he'll give so لأنها تحتمل الانتقال إلى جهة أخرى بالتحدي, because that your judgment could change based on reasoning, and also because there's basis of changing the direction of the of judgment with respect to the qibla from the hadith texts. Why? لأنه أمر شرعي, because the direction of the qibla is a shar'i matter. It's not a tangible matter. Right? How is it a shar'i matter? Meaning the type of exercise of judgment required for the qibla is a shar'i matter. It's not a tangible matter. Okay? And if anyone believes that, and we'll come to the masail of the qibla when we come to them, but if you can't see the Kaaba, you have the direction. Although facing closer to it is superior, but it's not a requirement. But it is superior. And the Sahaba prayed within very few degrees of the actual qibla. If you see Shaykh Keller's report in the form, the average deviation from the exact direction of the qibla of those masjids where the mimbar was established by the Sahaba of Rasulullah ﷺ is just a couple of degrees out of 360 degrees, like less than 1%, or something like that, like roughly. And these are faraway places. Cairo is not so close to Mecca, but the qibla established by Sayyidina, there's a few qiblas there established by Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As and the Sahaba, Sayyidina Mu'adh bin Jabal and others went to Yemen and established masajid there that are known and documented. Right? That they retain the same qibla. Right? So this is legally true, but the scholars of Islam paid great attention to figuring out the qibla, and said one of the wonderful parts of our tradition. Al-Biruni figured out that twice a year the Kaaba is, at Dhuhr time would be right on top of the sun would be right on top of the Kaaba at Dhuhr time at Mecca, such that if you're within the hemisphere of the qibla of the Kaaba, that half of the world, if you looked at the sun when it's Dhuhr, right at the moment of Dhuhr entry in Mecca, by looking at the sun, you're looking at the direction of the qibla. Okay? And of course, they knew how to calculate. Biruni sitting in India knew how to calculate prayer times in Mecca. Right? So the thing that people were, like, yeah, they didn't really know, right? Is not really knowing. Anyways, وَالنَّجَاسَةُ أَمْرٌ حِسِّي. On the other hand, najasa is a tangible matter. لا يصيرها طاهرة بالتحدي. That is not made pure. The najasa itself is not made pure by your judgment. Right? للزوم الإعادة بظهور النجاسة. And this ta'leel, to give proof, and that is why it is required to repeat if you see the actual filth. So you prayed in one thobe, then when you took it off, you saw, oh my goodness, there's all the najasa. So it had urinated just on the pocket. Right? So when you put your hand in the pocket after the prayer, you had a pool of najasa there. Or whatever. بعد لظهور النجاسة بعد التحري في الثياب والأواني. This applies both to clothing, if you ended up praying in something that had an excessive amount of najasa, والأواني, or containers. Although, if there's any possibility of warding off having to repeat, you say, for example, you see, blood on your, you went like this before the prayer, and then you say, oh, my nose must have bled. They say that تضاف الأحداث إلى أقرب أوقاتها. Acts, contingent events are ascribed to the nearest possible time. Right? So you pray, so you walked into a wall, like I did in Frankfurt, and then you remember afterwards you went like this, which is not something you always do, and you prayed, and then you see a streak of blood on the same place. You say, well, later, then maybe I also went like that after the prayer, and that ihtimal, that possibility, lifts the requirement of makeup. And there's some amazing details of that, like what if one got confused about because they had to do it with farmers, for example. So let's say you have some grain, and of course there's a lot of things that are excused, right? But let's say the neighbor is jealous of your crop, so he sent his whole tribe of kids, 8 of them, to urinate over your wheat. So they all squatted and urinated. Now you forgot where exactly they urinated. So one of the ways of purifying it, because like one of my friends used to say, funny is funny, but money is money. So you don't know which one. Where is the najasa? You split it in half. And what do? Don't exercise your judgment which one is tahir or najis. You split them in half. The first, is it tahir or najis? I don't know. Possibility is it's tahir, you could sell it. Second one, possibility is tahir, you could sell the second one too. But then there's a lot of argument amongst the fuqaha, can you do that or not? In the end, you for sure sold something najis. But there's ways around that too. So that's something that if nerds want to do, what do you do if the neighborhood children urinated over your wheat? There's a number of ways out of it. Some are sounder than others. But anyways. فمتى جعلنا الثوب طاهرا بالاجتهاد للضرورة لا يجوز جعله نجسا باجتهاد مثله. Just going back to the issue, once you determine that the garment was pure using ijtihad, using your best judgment out of necessity, right? إذا تعذر اليقين يصار إلى الظن. When certainty is not possible, you're forced to use your judgment. لا يجوز جعله نجسا. It is not permitted to consider it filthy باجتهاد مثلي, with a similar ijtihad, because of the principle we've taken. فتفسد كل صلاة يصليها بالذي تحرى نجاسته أولا. So any prayer you do with what you first determined to be najis would be considered filthy. Right? So 2 garments, you said garment A is filthy, so you prayed in the second. Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib. Isha time came, you said, oh no, the second one is filthy. All the prayers you then, so you say, so then you wear the first one, which you originally deemed to be najis, you prayed for the next 2 days, you prayed with that one, the one you originally thought was filthy, but now you think it's not filthy, you have to repeat all those prayers. Because one ijtihad is not annulled by the other. Right? And this is all waswasa. Some, وتصح بالذي تحرى طهارته. And it will be valid with the one had deemed تحرى طهارته أي أولا. Okay? In the first instance. Okay? ولو تعارض عدلان. Now what if 2 people disagree? في الحل والحرمة, with respect to permissibility and impermissibility, such as of the right, of slaughtered meat. Now, one of the governing principles in this is, and we talked a little bit about this last time, correct? That so we're going to address this at 3 levels: the personal legal limit. Secondly, what is sound caution? And number 3, what is our collective responsibility? Right? So, at the level of personal responsibility, حلال حرام الإخبار عن الذبح من المعاملات لا من الديانات. Reporting regarding whether the meat was slaughtered or not is considered from transactional matters, not from religious matters. Such that the word in transactional matters, the words of a non-Muslim are accepted. Right? The non-Muslim tells you that this bread has no pork in it, you can take their word. You don't have to check more than that. Unless there are other troubling signs or whatever, but you can take their word for it. There's no legal obligation nor expectation that you verify. That's the legal limit. That would apply to an ingredient, it would also apply to the meat itself. Right? So if there's a non-Muslim store that says that our meat is from hand slaughtered, the meat has sources, you can take their word for it. At the level of personal permissive, personal responsibility. So that's the underlying issue. What if 2 people disagree? If 2 upright people disagree, لو تعارض عدلان في الحل والحرمة بين أخبر عدل, such that one upright person informs بأن هذا اللحم ذبيحة مجوسي, that this is slaughtered by a Magian, whose ذبيحة is not permissible. They're not considered أهل الكتاب. وعدل آخر بأنه ذكاه Muslim. Another upright person informs that this was slaughtered by a Muslim. لا يحل, is not permitted لبقائه على الحكم, because it remains on its impermissibility بتهاتر الخبرين, because the 2 reports annul each other. This is if, firstly, they're upright. Number two, they're sure. أخبر بيقين أو ظن غالب لا بالتوهم. Right? Right? Or بظن غالب. Right there. لا بمجرد وهم. Like, so most of Uncle Judgement, so oh, don't eat over there. I know they're a bunch of liars. That doesn't mean anything. Firstly, is Uncle established uprightness? You don't know? Right? And that's where you have to be very careful of dhulm. Right? Because the store owner is saying, I get this from a reliable source. Their word is accepted. Uncle is saying, I know that family, crooks and criminals, but practically speaking, is uncle of established uprightness? You don't have to investigate whether he's established upright. Is he clearly upright? You don't know? What is the weight of his opinion? And number two, okay, they're crooks and criminals, but that's not a judgment on the meat. Uncle, do you know that this meat is not halal? No. Right? That's of no consequence. Right? And this one, I heard, Rawa WhatsApp, right? Yeah. Or, Rawa, Uncle, I don't know, Kama akhrajahu WhatsApp, right? It's not like Bukhari and Muslim, right? I saw a WhatsApp message, don't eat at Uncle Hamza's shawarma. Right? And poor Uncle Hamza loses business, that's dhulm. That's dhulm. That's at one level. But on the other level, of course, there's practical caution that applies to halal and haram, which we talked about when we looked at the principles of halal and haram, right? There's practical caution. The practical caution is impractical to a large extent without the third. The third is, it is a communal obligation, right? One of the responsibilities in a Muslim land of the wulatul amr, of the authorities, right? It was called al-ihtisab or hisba, right? Which is to take those buying and selling to account for adhering, number one, to the limits of the Sharia, and number two, to safeguard the recognized interests of the masalih al-Muslimin, right? Because the wilaya, the authority that the ruler has is لحفظ مصالح الناس, right? To safeguard the best interests of people. So for that, in a Muslim country, it's part of the country, the ruling, something related to meat, for example, then there will be a process of verification. Right? And there's great literature written on this issue of hisba and ihtisab, of taking accountability. And there's of all kinds, even construction. Right? There were amazing construction codes in old Muslim cities. The Hanafis have multiple books on Kitab al-Hitan, the book of walls. Because the fiqh of walls is quite complicated. Right? We have houses next to each other, and let's say you have 16 children, 8 daughters, and your next door neighbor decides to build a 4th floor. And you want your family to have access to your courtyard. Can you do that? But what can you do? Can you go demolish his 4th floor? I mean, you're a Qadi, maybe you could, but when there's rule of law, you can't do that, right? You take it to the authorities, right? Take it to the authorities. And if you take it to Qadi Khan said, no, you can't do that. Now, how does he decide? Because they codified the fiqh related to these things, to preserve the public interest. Now, in the absence of Muslim rulers, we have an obligation as a community for there to be halal standards. Right? And this is from kifaya, and it should be supported. And these halal standards should be set by people of knowledge. The basic thing, anyone who sets standards, one question to ask yourself about the standards: who are the ulama behind this project, or who endorse this project? If there aren't any, then those standards are built on someone's imagination. And Sharia is not built on anybody's imagination. Okay? Okay? So that's because if there are standards, then caution is easier. Right? But there are guidelines, right? That look for people who appear to be upright. Who appear to be upright. They are applies to Muslims. If there's a store that everything else in it is haram, but they say the meat is halal, they blast music that's haram. Their staff is not observing the limits of the Sharia. There are all kinds of other haram things, but the meat is halal. Right? There are many cases where you would be less likely to believe a Muslim than a non-Muslim. A non-Muslim is not responsible for the limits of the Sharia. In practical terms. Ultimately, are they held accountable for it? That's a separate thing. So in something like this, look at the Amarat al-Zahira, right? That they don't seem to. And what are reasonable standards? For example, do they have some kind of recognized halal certificate? So at a practical level, one should find out what are reliable halal certification companies and what are not, and to stick to that, right? And to be careful. And the principles of caution, they come elsewhere, but that is practically here. But if somebody said that this is halal, then one can take their opinion on it. وَلَوْ أَخْبَرَا عَنْ مَاءٍ وَتَهَاتَرَا بَقِيَ عَلَى أَصْلِ الطَّهَارَةِ. But if two people say they differ, one says this water is filthy, the other says it's pure, one witness negates the other, and they're both upright, and they're both short. Basic question. One is to assess, and of course, you have to use your judgment. Does this person appear to be upright? And number two, are they short? And if you ask them, are you short? They say yes, they say, how do you know? So I'm just short. That means they don't know what they're talking about. So that's the section on tahadri. There's a couple of things, and then we'll pause for Maghrib. One is Imam al-Tahtawi has a page full of fawaid here, but there's a couple. And that whole section, the last footnote in Tahtawi in this section is precious. One is he mentions that the asl when it comes to meat is hurma. Right? If we're driving through Germany and you see a really nice cow, we just chop off its leg and roast it there? No. Right? Meat only becomes permissible if we're reasonably sure that it's been slaughtered in a sound manner. That's number one. And he has a nice tanbih about what if there's doubt. Right? What if there's doubt? We're not going to break that down. But it's a useful discussion for those who'd like to look at it. He has. If anyone has questions about it, they can ask out of class. But that's a useful discussion. And then we have about the section on wells. Now the section on wells, and we'll be stopping today over here, but the section on wells, people don't generally, you may think that, well, we don't need to know about wells because we have so much water. Right? Now, you may not necessarily always be in a place with a lot of water. Okay? Number one. Right? You may travel. You might get stuck somewhere. And also, part of learning is that, you may be in situations where people ask you who are in those situations where there is lack of water. Right? And also just to have gratitude for the ni'mah that we have plentiful access to water. Unusual things can happen. Right? Like someone has a reservoir. Your building complex has a reservoir of water. I have a friend, and subhanAllah, just discarding Ismail, got a tumor in his brain. Early 40s, mid 40s. They moved to a rural area where they didn't have access. They were not connected to the water grid. They had a well on his property. Even though he was working in the city, but they got like a house slightly outside the city. It wasn't connected to the water grid. They're connected to their own well. What if a mouse died there? Right? So these rulings are practical. We had a well-like situation. We had a water tank in Jordan, and one day we opened the tap. I opened the tap, and a feather came out of the tap. I was so happy. I said, Allahu Akbar. I was so happy. Why? Because it meant that we could now apply the fiqh related to what if an animal dies in the well and the whole thing decomposed because the feather came through. And other things came through. I'll save you the details. And of course, so I told Umama, I'll go upstairs. And, you know how to get to the roof? I said, no. Go read your books. Poor lady. She went into the tank and had to wash out the tank, had to do a whole bunch of things, which you'll see at the end of the section. And also, thirdly, because there are many principles that are illustrated by this. So deliberately in the section on tahaddi today, we try to unpack a number of important principles. One of the reasons of going a little bit slowly in the beginning is for you guys to get the hang of reading the text and also to prepare and get ahead. The section on wells is now just one thing about wells. The fiqh of wells is established is textually established bil athar. Most of them are from the athar of the Sahaba. The qiyas, the legal analogy would be that it is impossible to purify the well water. Because if najasa falls in the well, the walls also get filthy. If the well has a constant supply of water, it would be next to impossible to clean it. Unless you can plug it, like it would require a lot of takalluf. That's very difficult. So, now that asl, that qiyas could have been left by mere reason had there not been texts, but it happened during the time of the Sahaba. A man actually died in Zamzam, and the Sahaba had to deal with it. And a number of texts which we'll see next week, and they exercised their judgment, applying the principles of, they understood from the Prophet ﷺ with respect to judgment, hardship, this, that, these governing principles. But when you see their application in the judgment of the Sahaba, from that, the subsequent generations deduce the rules related to what happened in different kinds of animals that die in wells. And that has many more applications than we might imagine. So we'll stop there. بإذن الله تعالى وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.